Welcome to Assembly Audible. I'm your host, Jennifer Pierce, multimedia content specialist with Assembly Magazine. Joining the Industry 4.0 movement is easier than you think. I'm joined by Dan McKiernan, the president and co-founder of eFlex Systems. Today we're exploring how three companies from different industries, of different sizes, and at different stages in their digital transformation got started. From no technical background to complete IT departments, we'll evaluate three different paths to success. Dan, welcome to Assembly Audible.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I'm really looking forward to learning about this. I know it's a hot topic, so to start with, can you describe to us what digital transformation is?
Yeah, that's so I think the best way to do this, because there's many different variations of it, but fundamentally, if you think about what we take for granted every day, and that's that smart cell phone in our hand. And if you go back before we had that in your life was a phone on the wall, or at many times, no digital connection while you were on the go, weather, email, all those things you just can do without thinking about them through this digital platform we carry around with us today is where we are, but in our personal transformation. But manufacturing is still back in the 90s, literally. They are just really getting started, maybe a third of the way into that, and that's the higher end, where they're leveraging web-based technology, mobile technology, digital guidance, all those things that we do every day without even thinking about it, lacks or doesn't really exist for the most part in manufacturing. So kind of sets the stage, laying the groundwork to say there's a lot to be gained by this digital transformation in manufacturing through efficiencies and so on.
Wow, that's really interesting. Are there things or factors that are forcing manufacturers to make the transformation, or is it purely voluntary?
It's really competitive advantage. For those that can get this in play and really leverage it, you're going to have a significant advantage competitively over your competition. So someone that maybe lags in this or decides they don't think they need it, they're going to probably be out of business in a matter of time.
Okay.
Fundamentally.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for clarifying. That gives me a pretty clear picture on what digital transformation is. What are some of the different stages of digital transformation that you see with your customers? Can you give me an example of a customer that started with basically nothing?
Yeah, sure. We do see quite a spectrum of different stages that they start in, but you'll see through this discussion, there's a common thread here. Got a couple good examples of customers. And this customer is a Midwest-based company. They build surface equipment that has a safety element to it, so there's regulatory layers on it. They're around 150 employees and roughly 50 million in sales. Family-owned, second and third generation running it now. And the type of manufacturing is like a job shop where they have, you'll run a same model for a batch of 10 or 100, and then they'll change over and they'll run that on that same equipment, they'll run for a different model. So there's a lot of changeover, but there is some consistency in their flow. They do have higher volume products that are run on dedicated assembly lines, but then they change over to run a different line. And then they have a specialty area of their business where it's more low volume, hand built with high specifications and technicians that may work on them for several days. And the challenges with them is that they'll build only one of these a year, and they have to remember all the steps to make sure everything was built to spec or not. I'm just highlighting to kind of give a snapshot of this company so that people might be able to relate to it.
Well, I think this is really fascinating.
So what I just described was kind of the company from a 10,000 foot view. Now we'll talk about what existed from an infrastructure point of view. In this case, family-based company, they've really had no IT support on the manufacturing floor. It was more an IT-centric, centered around the front office, taking care of the PCs and the networks and software that they might use up front. So really had nothing in place on the floor. At best, terminals out there that somebody might refer to, and a Wi-Fi network as needed. They were completely paper-based, meaning everything that flowed out of the front office was paper. You read job sheets that gave all the information on it. They would either, read this or add notes and handwrite information on it, but it was pure paper. Any work instructions that existed were in 3-ring binders and usually covered in dust and out of date. So they really weren't relied on at all. Traceability of information, meaning consumables and serial numbers and lot and batch numbers, were handwritten on paper forms and then scanned in the next day, created into PDFs. So if they had any kind of quality spill, they were searching through scanned PDFs and then deciphering someone's handwriting to try to find the information. So this was the root of where their challenges were when we reached them and started engaging with them.
I see.
I think at this stage, you can get a sense that they know they need to get their house in order and that they're going to find themselves in a competitive disadvantage in a short order. And you get a sense of that when you first engage them. For these guys, the manufacturing and industrial engineers were charged with finding something to get them in motion for their digital transformation, just the beginning, the first steps. Their highest level of requirements were centered around traceability, tracking of all the data electronically from raw material to consumables while the product was being built and assembled, all the way through final serialization and final product assembly. Our first steps were to engage with barcode scanning, where things were available so that information flowed in directly without handwriting errors or any errors whatsoever. The next thing we did was to standardize their work instructions. So this required us to get some infrastructure from an IT support out on the floor, where we needed to have a terminal that things can be interacted with through a touch screen or barcode scanning or keyboard such. So we took what work instructions they had, digitized them, and imported them into our work instruction system.
You added a layer of interactivity.
Yeah, definitely. And that was a big first step. So now with this infrastructure on the floor, barcode scanning could happen flawlessly and be guided through those steps, meaning at this step, scan this information or enter this information into this terminal. So instead of handwriting it on paper, it was it. And these work instructions were showing actual parts with dimensions and arrows and text guiding them. In some cases, GIFs, meaning short video loops, showing how some intricate pieces come together. It worked well. Now, once the operators had digital work instructions, they were able to, they were required then to stay on script, so to speak, because what they were struggling with was many times they would build this any way they felt like it. So meaning each operator built it their own way. At the end of the day, they got it done. Sometimes maybe errors happened or they were improperly built from a different stack up, so to speak, meaning you have 1, 2, 3, they go together and you can't go 2, 3, 5, for example. You can't just skip steps or do them in the wrong order.
Of course, this is my introduction to what you and your company, what you do, but it makes sense to me that you couldn't, you have to streamline things, especially if it's a system you're going to build upon, right? So you can't just have it be a free for all, I guess.
And that's what a lot of manufacturers will find when they don't have some level of control and guidance, meaning I'm going to show you how to do this, and I'm going to have things that are going to be interlocked to ensure that you're on each step and that you advance one step at a time. And there's things that interlock to ensure that the previous step was done before you could advance to the next.
Interesting.
So for these guys, once they had their this infrastructure in place, it helped them considerably on their high volume side, meaning where they ran large batches on a more high volume assembly line. But on that side of the business, they had more employee turnover because it wasn't as technical as it is on their, the more specialty side of the plant. So the idea here was that their best people on that side of the plant for their high volume line were constantly training new hires. So with this digitization of the work instructions, and a new hire could simply shadow somebody, work with the same work instructions that they would be doing on the line, offline. In a day or two of acclimating and follow through and some shadowing, they could be very productive right away on the line. So because of the high turnover that they're experiencing, this significantly reduced the training time and allowed them to get people put right to work and keep their high value people in their most valuable areas of the plant.
I see.
And again, the work for the low volume hand built area, they had the very strict instructions to follow. And some of these builds were several days long. So that way they knew where they left off if they had to come back to it after a break or maybe another day or two later. So in this part, what we had after we had these things working and everybody comfortable with it, then they decided to go further with that and start integrating interlocking of their process. So in the first layer, we added pick lights, meaning at this step, because of the model you're building, we had to turn on lights to tell them to pick from these bends to apply to this product. And then we could also barcode scan that part to capture the serial and lot number. So we had that information that would then roll up underneath the final serial number of the part or product they were building. And then finally, where they are right now in this process was they're buying DC tools that have, the ability to be fully interlocked to our system. So now when they come to the step where they're going to be fastening or tightening some critical bolts on their product, the DC tool is turned on at that point, told what, final torque and angle it needs to be set to and how many there are to run down. And then the part won't, the step won't advance until the DC tool says it's been satisfied. And today that's where they are. They're implementing DC tools. So in a kind of a time range, this was about a 2-year window. We got the full infrastructure in place in the first year. Everybody was happy, settled down. And then we started adding more interlocking and electronic guidance from like pick lights and DC tools and barcode scanning. So that's kind of the first example of somebody that really had nothing, a very basic shop, and built that out. I think people could identify with that as an example.
Well, that is so fascinating to me, and I'm sure it's rewarding in your position to watch it grow. And then I also was wondering, in some ways, is it easier to start from scratch, as opposed to piecing things together, which kind of leads us to our next question. If you could give me an example of someone helped that was already fairly digitized.
It's a good question on that last part. Is it easier to start with nothing? I'd say no. I mean, if you have something, it's always good to build on something that's already in place because those are just steps you have to go through. But don't let that be a discouraging point. You've got to do fundamental things and get the infrastructure in place and then build on it. Mm-hmm. So we pick you up wherever you are in the process.
Okay.
So the next example is a customer was much more advanced in their evolution of process digitization. They're an industrial equipment manufacturer. They have about 1,000 employees, about 500 million in sales. And their manufacturing would be considered a repetitive type of process. They have dedicated lines for each one of their products with several different models that run down these lines. So more advanced manufacturing, more dedicated manufacturing lines and different variations and proliferation that came down those lines. As far as the digital transformation goes, they were ahead of most in manufacturing. So because of their size and the need to have it in their industry, they had created a homegrown solution, meaning their early stages, their IT department built something in-house. And they had a software in-house that was maintained and implemented by their IT department. And it lasted quite, for many years. And it met the minimum requirements. Because of its age, it didn't take advantage of digital technologies and web-based and all the advancements that we talk about and we can enable, but it met the fundamentals. And that was, again, much more advanced than most and many. But what it did for them was it provided a significant burden on the IT department. Not only did the IT department have to maintain the software and have knowledge on staff to be able to program and make changes to and keep it current, operating systems, all the things that happen to software over time, but they were also responsible to implement it on the floor, to deploy it on their processes. And when the industrial engineers added a new model or wanted to rebalance their lines or make any changes to their process, IT had to go down on the floor and do that. So this was a double burden, meaning they had to maintain software and they had to actually implement it and maintain it on their processes. And when we met with them gosh, maybe 5 years or 6 years ago, that's the state they were in. Their biggest complaint and challenge was that it was too much of a burden. They would rather have been able to maintain the software, but let the industrial engineers and manufacturing engineers implement it, make changes to it, but that wasn't the case. So for several years, they moved along in that environment, meaning they continue to maintain it, and they continue to maintain it on the floor itself in the process. But as time went on, they lost that knowledge of maintaining the software side, which was critical, because once they had nobody that could maintain the software side of it, now they were looking at, what are we going to do? We know at some point in time we're going to have a problem, and this thing's going to go down, and we're going to be in trouble.
Right.
So we met with them, or they reached back out to us and kept in touch, but they were saying, we're ready. Now is the time, and let's get started. So we started with them by picking one of their lines and started the transition of moving from their existing systems, moving the information that was critical into our system, and bringing more and more of the feature sets that we had. So for example, their system didn't provide any operator guidance in station, and it was very basic, if at all, any interlocking to their process equipment like DC tools, pressing, testing, and those types of things. So it was more of a just fundamentals, capturing serial numbers, lot numbers, ensuring key steps were done at certain steps in the process.
Okay, well, this is so interesting. It's almost like they needed a gigantic upgrade. Is the way I thought of it. I mean, I know that's really a basic way to put it, but that's kind of what it sounds like.
No, I mean, it's what they were burdened with. So it kind of came to finally fruition that they had to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
They really liked our stuff. So when that time came, we got the call, and that was exciting because they were ready to go when we were doing it. We, after we retrofitted their lines, now we're at this point, we got all their fundamental or minimal requirements in place. And that was, even from that point, we were enhancing their process, meaning we were digitally guiding operators. And, the simple, easy things such as barcode scanners now were tied into our system, and they were getting, digital work instructions. And each step, if something was required, information was captured, or, interlocking was at that step. And now we're integrating DC tools again with them, adding kitting, meaning they'll fill a bin with all the key parts for that model, and that bin will follow that part down the assembly line, and people will pick from it, consuming parts. And also adding vision inspection. So there's a lot of tools that we can add to it, but they're really moving along nicely now. And as that one completes, we're going to be adding rolling this out to the remainder lines at their sites. So there were somebody that had a system in place, fairly advanced, and just basically had to make the leap to an outside vendor that could best fit their needs, and then implement it and grow with it.
Okay. When you work with someone who has a fairly digitized starting place, are there certain things that you see, benefits that you see right away versus some benefits that take a little time to chart?
In this case, to answer the question, from somebody that has nothing to somebody that's more advanced, what you see is things move faster in general. Yeah, so the implementation is faster because the infrastructure is in place. So that's one less hurdle. We have people that are knowledgeable for these, that has a software system that can engage in their process directly. So we don't have that learning curve in front of us. So what you get to is you get kind of to where you're going to see some strong returns quickly. And where they were deficient in their older software, we had lots of data that were available. We capture the timing down to the very basic level. So each step you capture the timing and any data that's gathered. So they were able to start refining their processes more granularly, meaning they could find a station, not only a station that was going over cycle, but they could tell down to the very basic task level, which task was consistently or variable in time, meaning had the most variation in it, and where they needed to either improve how a part was presented or how something was presented to the operator so that he could do that one step quicker, easier, or maybe move one of these steps to another station before or after it to balance the workload and make the line flow smoother. So they were able to move quickly, deeper into better refining their process and have more visibility into it across the board in this case.
That's really interesting. That is really fascinating. Okay, so you've given me an example of a customer that started from the beginning, and then the one we just talked about was a little more, or much more advanced. How do you deal with someone that is somewhere in the middle?
So somewhere in the middle is relative. I had to find something that I thought fit in the middle, but as you'll see, as we wrap up, there's pretty common layer here, and we'll get into it. So this company is quite large. In fact, the largest of all three of them, but the way they're structured makes it kind of feel smaller and, well, let me just describe it. So they're a multinational conglomerate that owns many, many brands with many facilities around the world. They're, a Fortune 250 company. So 15 billion in sales. That's, it's quite large, 50,000 plus employees. So, a major company, but they own many brands and have many divisions. And we were working with just one division that had 4 sites scattered around a few states. So you have this very big company, but it was treated and acted like a relatively small company. The challenge was that each division was its own cost center, and it ran like an independent company. In some ways, a lot like our other family-owned company that we referred to, but they had additional resources because of the corporate overhead that they had. So on new and major projects, they could get funding for things that they presented and got initiatives they wanted to get moving on. But for a company like this, as big as they are, there was no central corporate coordination of projects for digital, evolution or quality improvements, anything whatsoever. So each plant was on their own. And in this particular one, they build industrial motion equipment, so to speak. I'm trying to keep these pretty generic so that really doesn't matter, but, just meat and potatoes manufacturing. Mm-hmm. They were, again, highly reliant on paper and wanted to digitize that part of their process in an effort to improve quality and throughput. So, they had some decent systems in place. They weren't burdened with a lot of turnover. These were, these divisions had employees that had worked there for long parts, pretty much their whole career. So their operators were consistent. And they weren't struggling with turnover, but they had a lot of variation. They built different products. Some of them were highly technical and took many days or hours. Some of them were lower volume. So digitizing their work instructions, digitizing as much as they could to improve quality and throughput was their initial kind of focus.
This is so interesting to me.
Yeah, it can be. I love manufacturing, and it's fun. No matter where you go, you'll see something new that you didn't see in the last place. So it's always fun. These guys relied on paper, and they wanted to digitize their process, improve quality and throughput. Each department had its own equipment. So, several departments that ran a variation of their product had its own test cell. It had its own various specialty manufacturing product, and then also their assembly processes. So many departments, but each one of the departments and the equipment in the department were not connected and very siloed. So there was no coordination for scheduling. There was no visibility into their process. They just had good employees that could build their product reliably and meet the requirements that they were held to at that point in time. As kind of to speak to what their infrastructure was in place, they had, again, kind of basic infrastructure on the floor, on the manufacturing floor. They had IT drops in key areas of the plant. Not every piece of equipment was connected. And from a controls engineering perspective, virtually none. They relied on outside resources for anything that they needed to have done to connect to equipment or things. They bought equipment, and then when they needed that equipment worked on, they called that vendor back in. For scheduling of production into that processes, it was completely manual. And that was based on or relied on tribal knowledge of the people, the process, and the equipment for that specific area. So, if that guy was sick or he moved on to a new process, somebody else had to learn that area very well before they could fluidly schedule production through those areas because it was so disconnected. Our contact at this place was dedicated through or centered around lean initiatives and quality improvement. That was his criteria. And that's pretty much the difference that you're going to see from like a family-owned company to, this division that was running similarly to the family-owned company, but this division had a very large company that owned it and could give them funding for these types of initiatives. So we were fortunate where we had somebody who was dedicated to making this happen and be successful. The upside in this case was this person came from production, which helped significantly when we rolled these systems out. His former peers trusted him when we brought out new systems and ideas and equipment and gave us, solid feedback instead of kind of resisting it or, the traditional pushback you get from production when you change things from them. They like to do it their way. It works. Leave us alone. Our first task, like you're hearing me say over and over again, was to digitally present work instructions and guide them through these steps as everything was built for each model type and variation they built. And again, in this case, it was challenging because each operator, these were lifelong, these people had been there for many years. They like to do it their own way. And as long as at the end of the day, it was built right and it tested okay, it was fine. But we saw a lot of variation in productivity. So in this case, it was challenging. We worked with the operators, got feedback, tried different things. And again, everything, the feedback was implemented, back and forth process, and now it's settled down into something that works very well for both, production management and the production people, and everybody's happy. And that system became very stable and was very helpful. And we saw a lot of return on that investment. And again, once that stuff was in place, we were able to connect more and more equipment and add more and more interlocking to these processes to control the quality process and also to provide visibility into the timing of elements of work, which would go into how to refining the throughput and improving throughput. We added DC tools. Again, like I've said to the others, these are common threads. You'll see, basic fundamental things, DC tools, prompting lights and verifying things that were done, sensors that air proof that something was present or not. After we got DC tools and running, pick lights were in place, added barcode scanning for lots of numbers that were consumed for quality control and traceability. And finally, the last thing we added for them was connecting all of their final test equipment. In this case, everything they built had to get ran through a test stand. And once it got tested, this was digitally signed off. And then once we had that record in our system, when it went to pack out would scan it and it would look back into our system and verify that all the steps were done, including the final test station. So their quality significantly increased. And with these other visibility ways to refine the process and look into it for different timing elements, they improved throughput significantly as well. And based on that success, our single engineer, who was our champion, was given more staff because they saw quick returns on these things and it saw value right away. And then as time went on, this division shared successes with other divisions. And now we're engaging other divisions. So the first division, we've rolled it out at the first site. And now the second and third site are happily implementing these ideas under the guidance of our original champion and his staff. And now they've shared that with other brands, so to speak, and carrying those ideas into other areas. So it kind of plants a seed and it grows. It's interesting.
I think looking at the big picture must be really fascinating. And I was just thinking, like, you must have, well, obviously this is your expertise, but it must take a lot of time and analysis to study the manufacturers and, come up with solutions. And you must have to look at the big picture really carefully.
For each, early on for us, it was challenging, and we kind of reacted to wherever the customer was and tried to jump in and quickly react to whatever they asked us to do. But what we had to do was we stepped back and learned from, quite a bit of effort going into a lot of different companies and had various types of success, and say we see these common threads. And what most importantly was they needed to pick a project that they could see in a relatively short period of time, some success and a relative return on investment. If we couldn't get there, this probably wasn't going to move any further than that. So we created a pilot program that's structured around that. And early on in our engagement, that's what we try to do, is say, let's identify a project, let's meet these criteria, and here's what we will expect at the end. And once we get everybody on board and all the boxes checked, it works really well in that manner.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. So, what is the common thread among all three examples that ensured their success?
Yeah, as you probably have heard most of them. You can see, start with a manageable problem that you can have a success and show a return on that effort, on that investment. Mm-hmm. Build on that success by adding more features and more control to that process to again, build on that original success. Again, a common thread that it wasn't implicitly said, it is to have dedicated people on these projects, meaning a champion that's going to see it from beginning to end, that's respected on the floor, and that has the authority and the wherewithal to see these projects to some level of completion. Because if they don't, we've seen many times, they'll flounder and ultimately the project will just die off to the side and they'll continue as normal. So dedicated people that are driven to see something to its completion is a very important piece of it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what size company you are or where you are in your digital evolution, so to speak. There's always a place to start and grow from there and add to it, because there's so much to add and gain to it, and gain from it. Mm-hmm. And that's really how we modeled our pilot program, was to jump in, define a project, ensure that the right people were in place, that we had support from management, and that all these things that we can see from beginning and end could happen, and then we could help them see some success.
Wow, such a fascinating topic and expertise.
It's fun. We do have, at the end of the day, we have fun.
So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you answering my questions. I was excited about this topic, and I really enjoyed learning about the facets of digital transformation.
Thank you. I appreciated sharing them.
eFlex delivers the simplest path to digital transformation. Their powerful web-based solutions provide process control with digital work instructions, traceability, and data collection for every part. A lean competitive advantage to maximize quality and throughput on the plant floor. They strive to empower manufacturers to join the Industry 4.0 movement with cost-effective, easy-to-use solutions, permitting them to become agile, data-driven, and best-in-class. You can learn more about eFlex and its products and services at www.eflexsystems.com. For more insights on assembling discrete parts into finished products and the people behind it all, visit our website, assemblymag.com, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast to keep up with our latest episodes. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, so we invite you to follow us there too. This has been Assembly Audible. Thanks for listening.